A predator joined the class, but it was the human Deathworlder who shocked them. Oh! The moment Sarex walked through the door, every student in the room stopped. Breathing. I did not blame them, I stopped. Breathing too. I am Vel a Thessari. And my kind have excellent survival instincts. Those instincts were screaming at me the second I saw him. Sarex was Krath 7 ft tall. His body was wrapped in dark plated scales that caught the light like polished stone. His three-jointed arms were folded at his sides, but even folded, they looked like things designed to break other things. His eyes were forward-facing, amber and completely still, predator eyes, the kind of eyes that measure distance and weight and speed before the brain even finishes a thought. He moved to the back of the room without speaking. Every student he passed leaned away from him. Not obviously, just slightly, the body doing what the mind had not yet decided to do. Professor Yorn, our Mandorian instructor, gestured to the empty seat Sarex had chosen. Welcome to interspecies relations, Sarex. We are glad to have a Krath perspective in this course. Sarex did not respond. He sat. The chair barely held him. I watched him from 3 rows forward. I kept telling myself I was being rational. The Krath had been part of the Galactic Union for 40 years. They were not permitted to harm other students. There were rules. There were protocols. There were security systems in every corridor of the academy. None of that made the tension in my chest go away. The class continued. Professor Yorn spoke about cross-species communication barriers and the importance of context in diplomacy. Good material, important material. I took notes, but I noticed that every student in the room was doing the same thing I was doing, listening to the professor with one part of their mind and keeping track of Sarex with another. It was not a choice, it was biology. For his part did nothing threatening. He listened. He occasionally looked at his data pad. Once he asked a question about communication signals in low visibility environments, and his voice was lower than I expected, almost measured, but the moment he spoke, the whole room went still again, the way a forest goes still when something large moves through it. That was the first day. The second day was when things changed. I arrived early. The room was mostly empty. 2 Midori students were talking near the window. A single Farath student was reading quietly in the corner. And at the back of the room, already seated, was Sarex. And then the door opened again, and a human walked in. I had seen humans before. The academy had several. They were not unusual exactly, but they were also not common in the advanced academic tracks. This one was male, young by human standards, with short brown hair and pale skin, with a faint redness across his nose. From what I later learned was called sunburn. He was wearing a standard student uniform, carrying a bag over one shoulder, and he was looking around the room with a calm, interested expression. The way someone looks when they are trying to find a good seat, not when they are surveying for danger. His name was Dax Harlow. I learned that when Professor Yorn introduced him at the start of the session. He had transferred from the orbital sciences track. He nodded once when his name was spoken, said, "Hey, thanks," and sat down 2 rows in front of Sarex. Sarex noticed immediately. I do not know how to describe what a Krath looks like when they are assessing something. It is not aggressive. It is not Threatening, not exactly. It is more like a machine running a calculation, every visible indicator of emotional response goes quiet, the bioluminescent patches along their neck and jaw, which usually shift slowly through dim colors, go completely dark. The breathing slows, the head turns by fraction, not toward the subject but past them, the way a predator's eyes do not look directly at prey because direct focus triggers flight instincts. Sorex did all of that looking at Dax, and Dax, within about 10 seconds of sitting down, turned around and looked directly at Sorex. Not in alarm, not in the slow, terrified way the rest of us had looked at the Krath. He turned around the way you turn around when you feel someone looking at you quickly and without drama. And then he looked straight at Sorex, met those amber, forward-facing predator eyes and smiled. It was not a nervous smile. It was not a performed smile, the kind beings use when they are trying to seem braver than they are. It was a small, easy, completely relaxed expression, the kind that says, I see you and it is fine. Sorex said nothing. His bioluminescent patches stayed dark. Dax turned back to face forward. I realized I had been holding my breath. I let it out slowly. Professor Yorn began the lesson. I tried to focus on it, but I kept thinking about that smile. I had been in the academy for 2 standard years. I had sat in rooms with Krath students 3 times before, always temporary. Exchanges always tense. Every student in every one of those rooms had done what I did. They had leaned away. They had tracked the Krath with that background awareness that never fully switched off. They had been careful. Dax Harlow had turned around and smiled. I told myself, maybe he did not understand what he was looking at. Humans I had read had a complicated relationship with danger. Recognition. Their home world was severe by galactic standards, perhaps their threat detection systems were tuned differently. Perhaps they simply could not tell when something was dangerous. That was the explanation I preferred. It was much more comfortable than the alternative. The alternative was that Dax Harlow had looked at Sorex, understood exactly what he was looking at, and genuinely did not find it alarming. That thought sat in the back of my mind for the rest of the session, quiet and strange, like a sound you cannot quite identify but cannot stop hearing either. After class, I watched Dax pack up his bag. Unhurried, he paused to make a note on his data pad. He glanced at the window. He yawned. Sorex left first, moving through the room with that heavy, controlled walk that made everyone adjust their position by a few centimeters without meaning to. He passed within arm's reach of Dax on the way to the door. Dax did not move, not 1 cm. He just kept writing his note, and as Sorex passed, he said without looking up, see you tomorrow. Sorex stopped just for a moment. Then he continued out the door without responding. I stood there for too long, staring at the empty doorway. There was a Farath student beside me, a small, four-armed girl named Pri, who I had spoken to a few times in the corridor. She leaned close and whispered, "Did the human just talk to it, to him?" I said because even I knew that was the correct thing to say. Did the human just talk to him? She corrected herself. She did not sound any less alarmed. I looked at Dax, who was now walking toward the door, bag over his shoulder, still completely relaxed, and I said the Only honest thing I could think of. I have know what just happened. That night I pulled up what I could find. About humans in the general database. The entry was long, longer than I expected. I had always known in a broad sense that Earth was a difficult world. A high gravity, high radiation, biologically complex place that had produced a species with unusual endurance, but I had not read the details before. I read them that night. Pathogens that could rewrite internal systems. Atmospheric events that released more energy than most military weapons. Fauna in every biome evolved to neutralize or consume other fauna. Oceans full of creatures large enough to destroy small vessels. Geological activity that regularly remade entire land masses. Humans had not just survived all of that, they had named every single one of those things, cataloged them, studied them, built structures next to them, and called it home. I read until my vision started to blur from tiredness. Then I closed the pad and lay in the dark for a while, thinking about a human student who had looked at a Cathar predator with calm eyes and a small, easy smile. Maybe I had been asking the wrong question all day. Maybe the question was not whether Dax Harlow understood what he was looking at. Maybe the question was whether Sorex understood what he was looking at. I fell asleep with that thought, and I did not find it comfortable, but I did find it honest. Tomorrow there was survival biology. I had a feeling it was going to be an unusual class. Professor Yorn taught survival biology on the third floor of the sciences wing, in a room with a large display wall and enough seating for 30 students. We were 22. The course covered adaptive physiology, environmental threat response, and the biological strategies different species used to persist in hostile conditions. It was popular mostly because the material was genuinely interesting, and partly because Professor Yorn was one of the few instructors at the academy who never made a student feel small for asking a question. She began that session with a straightforward prompt. She asked each student to describe one survival feature of their home species, something biological, something that had been directly shaped by the conditions of their home world. The Furth student went first. She talked about her species' secondary circulatory system, a backup network of smaller vessels that could sustain basic function even if the primary system was compromised, useful on their home world, which had periods of intense atmospheric pressure that occasionally caused cardiovascular stress. A tall, narrow-limbed Varan student named Osa described their species' ability to enter a reduced metabolic state during resource scarcity, not true hibernation, but close enough to cut their biological needs by roughly 60%. Osa said this had been the difference between survival and extinction during several documented ice periods on their world. One by one, students described their adaptations. Some were straightforward, some were remarkable, all of them were interesting. I described the Thesari secondary eyelid, a transparent membrane that filtered high radiation light, developed over millennia because our home world star had unpredictable flare cycles. Professor Yorn thanked me and moved on. Then she called on Sorex. The room shifted. It always did when Sorex was the center of attention. Not in an obvious way. People did not move or make sounds, but the texture of the air changed. Everyone was listening just a little more carefully than before, with that extra layer of attention that the body adds when it wants to make sure it does not miss anything important. Sarek spoke in a measured, even tone. He described the Krath chemical paralytic response, a biological mechanism his species had developed as both an offensive and defensive tool. When threatened or in pursuit of prey, Krath could release a targeted compound through the tips of their claws capable of disrupting the motor function of most organic species within point of contact range. He explained the biological chain behind it with the same matter-of-fact clarity someone might use to describe how their eyes process color. The room was very quiet. Professor Yorn asked him to elaborate on the evolutionary context. Sarek described the Krath homeworld in brief, efficient terms: pack hunting across open terrain, competing with other apex species for territory. The paralytic response had not started as a hunting tool. It had started as a way to prevent the Krath from being hunted themselves by things larger and faster than them, before their intelligence and coordination had reached the point where raw physical capability was enough. There was a period, Sarek said, before our species developed full coordination instinct when we were not the top of our food chain. The chemical response is a remnant of that period. We no longer need it in the same way, but we kept it. Professor Yorn made a note. Vestigial advantage rather than vestigial loss. Excellent example. She looked across the room. Dax, you have not spoken yet. Tell us about a human adaptation. The room was already attentive from Sarek's contribution. Now it's sharpened again, but differently. There was a quality to the attention that was partly curiosity and partly that instinctive comparison the mind makes when it moves from one unfamiliar thing to another. Dax looked up from his notes he had been writing steadily through the other presentations. He said, his stylus down, and seemed to think for a moment, not in the way of someone who does not know the answer, but in the way of someone who has too many answers and is choosing between them. Which one do you want? He said. Professor Yorn tilted her head. Choose one that you think represents your species well. Dax nodded slowly. Okay. He leaned back slightly. Pain response. He said it simply. The way you say something when you do not yet know it is going to change the mood of the room. Most biological organisms, he said, treat pain as a stop signal. Your nervous system sends out a pain response, and the purpose of that response is to tell the organism to stop what it is doing, because what it is doing is causing damage. It is a survival mechanism. It protects the body by creating an incentive to retreat. He paused. Around the room, students were listening. Sarek had gone still in the way I had already learned to notice. Humans modified that. Dax continued. Somewhere along the way, the relationship between pain and behavior got more complicated. Pain still registers. We are not numb to it. But the signal does not automatically produce retreat behavior. For most humans under sufficient motivation, pain becomes information rather than instruction. The body says this is happening and the brain says noted. Keep going. Professor Yorn was quiet for a moment, then she said, that is a significant divergence from standard mammalian pain response models. Earth is a significant divergence from standard mammalian conditions, Dax said. Not proudly, just factually. Osa, the Varan student, spoke up. Carefully, you are saying your species continued to function through injury. Through a lot of things, Dax said. Injury, exhaustion, environmental extremes, the nervous system adapted to give the conscious mind more decision-making authority over the body's distress signals. It was not a clean process. It took a long time, and a lot of the things that made it necessary were genuinely awful, but yes, that is basically what happened. The room was quiet again. I looked around at the other students. Pry had her lower two hands folded tightly in her lap, which for Farith is a sign of concentrated thought. Asa was looking at Dax with an expression I could not fully read. Two of the Mandari students in the back were exchanging a look with each other. Professor Yarn spoke again. Can you give us context for the conditions that drove this adaptation? What were humans competing with or surviving against that made this response necessary? Dax took a breath. Everything he said it without drama, without exaggeration. Just a single word placed carefully. Earth is an old world with a lot of time behind it, he continued. Every niche is occupied. Every environment has multiple species competing for the same resources. Oceans have creatures large enough to swallow structures the size of this building. The deep forests have organisms that can breach most biological defenses. The atmosphere delivers events that reshape terrain on a regular basis. The microbial layer alone has produced more extinction-level threats to complex life than most worlds see in their entire biological histories. He said each of those things at the same even pace, the way you describe a place you know well. We did not get to the top of that environment because we were the strongest or the fastest. We got there because we refused to accept the outcomes that environment kept trying to hand us. The pain response modification was part of that. So was the endurance physiology. So was the capacity to operate under conditions that would shut down most complex nervous systems. We adapted faster than the things trying to remove us. That is the short version. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a room full of people is processing something at the same time, and none of them have quite finished yet. Professor Yorn looked at Dax for a long moment, then she said, that is one of the more comprehensive single question responses I have received in this course. Dax picked up his stylus and went back to writing notes. I turned slightly, enough to see Sorex in my peripheral vision. His bioluminescent patches were dark, not the restless dark of a predator tracking something, a different kind. Quieter, the dark of something that has just heard information it is still working through. The class continued. Professor Yorn moved on to environmental adaptation strategies and then to comparative immune response across biospheres, and the material was good and I took notes on all of it. But the energy in the room had changed. It was not tense exactly, it was more like the feeling of a space after something significant has passed through it. At one point during the immune response section, Osa asked Dax a follow-up question. Your species' immune system, Osa said carefully. How does it handle novel pathogens? Dax glanced over. Aggressively, he said, sometimes too aggressively. We have a history of the immune system doing more damage than the pathogen it was responding to. The body treats the unknown as a threat and responds with maximum commitment. It is not always accurate, but it adapts, suppressed, faster than almost anything we have encountered, Dax said. The system learns, sometimes within hours. The memory response is the part that actually kept us alive across the long stretches. If something tried to remove us before and failed, the body remembers, and the next time it does not need to think about it. Osa made a note, said nothing more, but she kept looking at Dax with that expression I still could not name. When the session ended and students began to gather their things and move toward the door, I noticed that the usual corridor around Sorex had gotten slightly smaller, not because people had deliberately moved closer to him. I think people were just slightly less focused on tracking his position. The attention in the room had shifted subtly, in the way attention always shifts when the most unexpected thing in the space is no longer the thing you had originally decided to watch. Sorex stood and moved toward the door. He paused for a fraction of a second near Dax's row, did not speak, did not look at him directly. Then he continued out. I gathered my things more slowly than usual. Pre appeared at my elbow. Vel, she said quietly. I know, I said. That planet sounds terrible, I know, and he just described it like it was normal to him. I said, it is. Pre looked at the door Dax had just walked through, a few steps ahead of us. Do you think he knows that we find it alarming? I thought about Dax's even voice, his unhurried choice of examples, the way he had said everything as though reading from a field report written by someone who was not particularly surprised by any of it. I think, I said, he knows. I think he just does not feel the need to perform alarm about it. Pre was quiet for a moment, then she said that might be the most alarming part. I could not disagree with her. We walked out into the corridor together, and I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to decide if what I was feeling was fear or something more complicated than that. The physical evaluation was announced on a Tuesday morning. The notice went up on the Academy's general board with a standard header and a standard explanation. All students in the applied sciences and cross-species studies tracks were required to complete a baseline physical assessment. The results would be used to assign lab partners for the upcoming hazardous practical curriculum. The assessment would cover 3 categories: reflex speed, grip and tensile strength, and pain threshold tolerance. The pain threshold portion was noted as utilizing a calibrated nerve stimulation device. The calibration was described as precise, standardized, and safe. Maximum stimulus had been designed to replicate mild to moderate discomfort for the median galactic physiology without causing any lasting effect. Nobody in my track was particularly happy about it. Pre had been quietly worried since the notice went up. Osa told me she planned to speak to the examiner in advance about Varan nervous system sensitivity. Several of the Mendori students were filing a formal clarification request to confirm the device had been calibrated for forearm configurations. The evaluation was held in the Academy's main training hall. Wide, bright room with high ceilings and clean floors designed to accommodate a range of body types and sizes. We were sent through in small groups, 10 students at a time, rotating through each station. A proctor was assigned to each station, and one senior medical officer was stationed near the nerve stimulation unit, which sat at the far end of the room on a raised platform, contained in a clean white housing with a contact panel and a readout screen. My group went midway through the session. I handled the reflex assessment without issue. My scores were average for the SARI, which meant slightly above the general galactic median. The grip assessment was fine. When I reached the pain threshold station, the proctor explained the procedure clearly. I placed my hand on the contact panel. I felt the stimulus, a sharp, precise sensation that climbed from mild to noticeable, and then held for 5 seconds before the machine registered and stopped. I flinched, not badly, but I flinched. The proctor made a note and thanked me. Sarix went through the assessment in the group before mine. I was near enough to watch from a distance. His reflex scores were extraordinary. The proctor, recording the numbers, actually paused and looked at the readout twice before entering it. His grip strength was at a level that required the examiner to manually switch the unit to its extended range, because the standard range maxed out before Sarix reached his ceiling. The room was aware of these numbers in the way a room is always aware of significant things, quietly and completely. At the pain threshold station, Sarix placed his hand on the panel. The proctor ran the test. Sarix sat through it without any visible response. Not a shift in posture, not a change in expression. The bioluminescent patches along his neck stayed at their resting dim blue throughout. When the machine registered and stopped, the proctor made a note and said the score was the second highest she had recorded this academic year. There was a murmur through the students, near enough to hear. Sarix returned to the waiting area with the same controlled walk he always used. Several students who were still waiting for their turn had moved very slightly away from the seats nearest to where he chose to stand. Then Dax's group was called. He went through the reflex station first. His scores came back quickly. Unremarkable was the word. I heard the student next to me whisper, "Not poor, but not exceptional, middle of the general range." The grip assessment returned similar results. Solid enough for a human male of his build, which was, to say, modest compared to most of the species in the room. I watched from across the hall. I was not sure what I had been expecting. Something different, maybe. The reflex scores and grip numbers did not match the picture Dax had drawn in survival biology. I felt briefly something almost like relief. Normalcy was easier. Normalcy meant the world made sense in the way I had organized it. Then he moved to the pain threshold station. He sat down at the panel. The proctor reviewed the procedure with him. Dax nodded, asked one brief question I could not hear from where I stood, and then placed his hand on the contact panel. The proctor ran the test. I was watching Dax's face. He was looking at a point on the wall slightly above the machine. Not at the readout, not at the proctor. Just a neutral fixed point. His expression was calm in the way that faces are calm when they are not performing, calm, just resting. Then the proctor frowned. She looked at the machine. She tapped the side panel. She looked at the readout. She looked at Dax. She said something to him, urgently but quietly, and Dax looked at her with a politely questioning expression. The proctor turned to the medical officer. The Medical officer came over quickly, looked at the machine screen and went. Very still. The machine had malfunctioned. Not catastrophically. The housing was intact. The contact remained clean. No physical harm was caused, but somewhere in the stimulus sequence, the calibration had slipped. Instead of delivering the standardized test signal, the unit had delivered approximately 3 times the intended level, a pulse that fell into the range, categorized on the unit's own scale as significant acute discomfort for most physiologies. Every student who had received even the properly calibrated dose had responded with some form of visible reaction. Some had pulled back slightly. Some had made a sound. Most had shown a change in breathing or posture. All of them had registered something externally, because that is what bodies do when something hurts them. That is the signal working correctly. Dax was sitting with his hand still on the panel, looking at the same point on the wall. His expression had not changed. The medical officer asked him, clearly and directly, if he was aware that the machine had malfunctioned. Dax looked at her. I felt something, he said. I assumed it was running. Is there a problem with the unit? The medical officer looked at him for a moment longer than the question that required. Then she said, yes. There had been a calibration error, and she wanted to confirm he was uninjured. I am fine, Dax said. The medical officer made a note. The proctor made a note. The machine was flagged for immediate maintenance review. Dax was cleared to complete the assessment. He stood, picked up his bag from the floor beside his chair, and moved toward the general waiting area. The training hall was not loud. It had not been loud during Sorex's results either, but this was a different kind of quiet. Sorex's results had produced the quiet of impression, of a room absorbing something that confirmed what it already suspected about what was impressive. This quiet was different. This was the quiet of a room that had just seen something and was not entirely sure what to do with it. I looked at Sorex. He was standing exactly where he had been standing before, in the waiting area. Having completed his assessment, he was looking at Dax, not with the measuring stillness he had shown on the first day of class, not the predator's calculation, something else, something I had not seen on a Krath face before, partly because I had not spent much time near Krath faces, but partly because I did not think the expression I was seeing was a common one for them. His bioluminescent patches were still dark, but not the active dark of focused attention. Something quieter than that. If I had to find a word for it, I would have said recalibration, not of the setting he was in, of a conclusion he had already drawn and was now revising. Dax set his bag down near the edge of the waiting area. He looked at his data pad. He made a note. He appeared to be doing exactly what he always did, which was existing at a pace entirely his own, apparently indifferent to the fact that half the room was watching him with expressions ranging from confused to unsettled. Priya appeared at my side again. She was doing that frequently now. I noticed. I did not mind. She leaned close. Her voice was barely above a breath. Vel, she said, I know. The machine gave him 3 times the normal amount, I know. And he asked if it was working correctly. I know. Priya was quiet for a moment, then she said very carefully, is that not the most terrifying thing you have witnessed in this building? I Thought about the question honestly. I had seen Sarex's strength scores come in above the machine's standard range. I had heard Dax describe Earth in a classroom voice that never once suggested he found it remarkable. I had watched Dax turn around and smile at a craft predator without a single centimeter of retreat. It is near the top of the list, I said. Across the room, the medical officer was completing her incident report. Proctor was marking Dax's threshold score in the records with a notation about the malfunction. I wondered what number they would write down. Whatever it was, it would not be accurate because the machine had not finished its intended range before the error occurred. They would note the malfunction. They would note that the student was unaffected. They would file it and move on, and somewhere in the back of every mind in that room, the question would stay. What would the number have been if the machine had kept going? I did not let myself finish that thought. I had a feeling the answer was not one my nervous system was ready to process. The library annex on the second floor of the Academy's north wing was mostly empty after evening meals. A few students used it for quiet study. The lighting was dimmer than the main library, and the seating was arranged in clusters rather than rows, which made it feel less like a formal space and more like a place where people went when they needed to think without being watched. I went there that evening because I had 3 assignments due before the end of the academic week, and my dormitory room felt too small. I found a cluster near the window, settled in, and opened my notes. I had been working for about an hour. When Sarex came in, he moved through the annex without speaking. He chose a cluster on the far side of the room, placed his data pad on the low table, and sat. In the dim lighting, the bioluminescent patches along his neck and jaw were at their resting color, a slow, muted blue-green that pulsed at the same rhythm as his breathing. I watched him for a moment, then went back to my work. About 20 minutes passed, then Sarex said without looking up from his data pad, "You are watching me." I stopped writing. I said. "I apologize." "Do not apologize. It is a reasonable behavior." I was not sure how to respond to that. I said nothing for a moment. "You are the sorry from the interspecies relations class," he said. "Yes, Vel." He looked up then. His amber eyes were steady. In the low light, the forward-facing orientation of them was very clear. "You are also in the survival biology class." "Yes," he returned to his data pad. I thought the conversation was finished. Then he said, "You watched the human during the evaluation today." The shift was smooth enough that I almost missed it. I set down my stylus. "I did," I said. "Most people did by the end." Sarex was quiet. The bioluminescent patches shifted almost imperceptibly. I decided, perhaps unwisely, to ask, "What did you think of it?" He did not answer right away. He looked at his data pad. He scrolled once, slowly, through something I could not see from where I sat. Then he said, "I made an error." The simple directness of it surprised me. "What kind of error?" "An assessment error." He set the data pad down on the table. "When the human arrived on the first day, I assessed him." I understood what he meant. I had watched him do it. "You categorized him?" "Yes." No apology in his voice, no embarrassment, just acknowledgement. "My species assesses incoming presences It is not voluntary. Every new organism that enters a space, I have a response that catalogs position, size, movement pattern, visual markers of capability. It happens before I have decided to do it, and you categorized Dax as I began. Low threat, Sarek said. Small, no visible. Defensive or offensive adaptations, no. Threat display, minimal mass, slow. Movement response on initial entry. He paused. I placed him in the lowest tier of the assessment. I thought about Dax walking in on that first morning, bag over his shoulder, looking for a good seat. And now, I said. Sarex was quiet for a moment. The bioluminescent patches did a slow, full cycle, dim to slightly brighter and back. I was taught to hunt by the time I was 4 standard cycles old, he said, not as training, as necessity. My home world does not allow for a long learning period. Things that move slowly get found. Things that are soft get found. Things that broadcast vulnerability get found. He turned his head to look at me directly. The first lesson every craft learns is what not to look like, because anything that looks easy is eventually tested by something. If you look easy, you will be tested before you are ready. I sat very still. He was not speaking to me aggressively. His tone was the same, measured one he had used in class. But there was a weight to the words that I felt physically, the way very cold air has a weight to it that regular air does not. The human looks easy, Sarex continued. No visible armor, no claws, no chemical defense markers that I can detect, no threat display, moderate physical readings in the evaluation. Everything my initial assessment registers as non-threatening. He looked back at the table. But I was wrong. Because of the pain threshold result, I said no. He said not only that. He was quiet for a moment. On the first day, he said, when I sat down, I was assessing the room the way I always do, identifying positions, noting response patterns, watching how every organism adjusted when I entered. He paused. Every organism adjusted. They did not know they were doing it, but they moved. They redistributed themselves in the space to maintain distance from me, even by a small amount, even the ones who were trying not to. The body does what the body knows. I did not say anything. I had done exactly that. I knew I had. The human did not adjust, Sarex said. Not on the first day. Not when I walked past him. Not at any point I observed. He picked up his data pad again, not to read it, more like an object to hold. I have entered many rooms in many places. I have never shared a space with another organism that did not make some adjustment in response to my presence. Even large organisms, even confident ones. He set the data pad back down. The human sat in the same position he chose when he arrived. He did not shift his weight. He did not alter his angle. He did not watch me with that second layer of attention that every other being in the room was using. He just sat. The annex was very quiet. Outside the window, the academy's courtyard lights were on, casting a pale, clean light across the stone. And then he spoke to me. Sarex said he would see you tomorrow. I said, yes. Sarex's voice was neutral, flat in a way that was not emptiness, but something more like careful balance. He said it the way you say something to someone you expect to see again and do not find unusual. Not a greeting with a message, not a Statement designed to demonstrate lack of fear. Just he paused. An ordinary thing, said because it was true. I thought about what that must have been like from where Sarex was sitting, a being he had categorized as non-threatening in the lowest tier of his involuntary assessment, treating him with the casual ease of a peer, not performing comfort, not performing courage, just being comfortable. Does that, I started carefully, change how you see him? Sarex looked at me. Yes, he said simply. How? He was quiet for long enough that I thought he might not answer. Then he said, in Krath culture we have a concept. It does not translate directly, but the closest meaning is a thing that does not respond to the rules of its apparent category. He folded his hands on the table. Most organisms behave in predictable patterns based on their visible capabilities. Small and soft means cautious. Large and armored means confident. The visible markers of capability determine the behavioral range. A small, soft organism that is cautious is behaving correctly. A small, soft organism that is not cautious is either very foolish or has something that does not show. He let that sentence sit. Which do you think Dax is? I asked. My initial assessment was foolish, Sarex said. I revised it after the first day. I revised it again after the biology class, and I revised it again today in the evaluation room. He paused. I have not needed to revise an initial assessment 3 times in the same week since I was very young and still learning what this world contained. I sat with that for a moment. The library annex was still quiet. Someone on the far side of the room had fallen asleep over a data pad, their breathing slow and steady. You said in the biology class, I said, that the craft have a word for things that fight back from something other than strength. He looked at me. You remembered that? It stayed with me. He was silent for a moment. The word is not about fighting, he said. I said it badly in class. The concept is not about a counterattack. It is about an organism that exists outside the expected logic of its environment, something that should, by every visible measure, be removed by the world it lives in, but is not. And when you look closely, you find that the world has tried repeatedly, and the organism is still there. He looked at the window, at the courtyard lights. We do not have a word for that because it is admirable. He said quietly, we have it because those organisms are the ones you learn about before you enter their range, because they are the ones that have been tested by everything in their environment and have not been removed, and whatever it is in them that prevented that removal is not visible from the outside. He turned back to look at me. Visible capability is information. Hidden capability is something else. Hidden capability, proven by survival across a long period against severe conditions, is what my people consider genuinely worth understanding. The room was quiet, and that word, I said slowly, you used it in connection with humans. Yes, I thought about the Earth database entry I had read, the geological activity, the atmospheric events, the oceans, the pathogens, the species count, the extinction events, the sheer volume of forces that world had directed at the organisms living on it. And then I thought about Dax in the evaluation room, sitting with his hand on the panel, watching a point on the wall while a malfunctioning machine delivered 3 times what it was Supposed to. And asking the proctor calmly if something was wrong with the unit. What is the word? I asked. Sorek said it. I will not attempt to write it in your language because the pronunciation is not something I can translate cleanly. It was 2 syllables. The first syllable rose. The second fell. It sounded to my ears like something between acknowledgement and warning. Does it mean enemy? I asked. No, he said. Does it mean friend? He was quiet for a moment, then he said, it means something that I have not yet decided I fully understand, something I need to learn more about before I assign it a final position. I thought that was probably the most honest answer I had ever heard anyone give in the Academy's North Wing Library Annex. We sat in silence for a while after that, not the uncomfortable silence of 2 beings with nothing to say. The specific, thoughtful silence of 2 beings who have said something real and are letting it settle. Outside, the courtyard lights held steady, and somewhere across the building, a human student named Dax Harlow was probably in his room writing notes or reading something on his data pad, completely unaware that a Krath predator had spent the evening revising his threat assessment for the 3rd time in 1 week. I found to my own surprise that I was not afraid of what that meant. I was something else, something that felt a little like the edge of understanding, not quite there yet, but moving toward it. The practical was scheduled for the last Thursday of the assessment period. Professor Yorn announced it 2 weeks in advance, which gave students plenty of time to prepare. The instructions were straightforward. Students would be divided into groups of 4 or 5. Each group would enter a separate simulation chamber and work through an emergency scenario. The scenario would be drawn from actual Galactic Union incident records. It would be presented in real time with no advance information about the type or scale of the emergency. Groups would be assessed on decision making, resource allocation, communication under pressure, and overall outcome. She did not say at any point that the exercise was designed for failure. She did not say that the scenario parameters were calibrated to escalate past any single group's realistic response capacity. She did not say that the Academy had been running this particular practical for 11 years and that the historical completion rate was slightly above 12%. None of us knew any of that until the debrief. I was assigned to a group with 4 other students, Osa the Varan, a Mindori student named Quell, who was quick and precise and had the best spatial reasoning in our cohort, and Sorix, and Dax. When I saw the assignment, I looked at it for a long time, then I sent a message to Pri, who had been placed in a different group, telling her I hoped her scenario was easier than mine. She replied that she hoped I survived. I told her that was dramatic. She replied that she had seen my group assignment, and she stood by her statement. We gathered outside the simulation chamber on Thursday morning. The chamber was a sealed room about the size of a lecture hall, with environmental controls that could alter temperature, air quality, light, and in spatial layout through combination of physical mechanization and projected overlays. The scenarios it could run were limited only by the incident records in the Union database. Quell arrived first, then me, then Osa, then Dax, then Sorix in that order. The 5 of us stood outside the chamber door. There was a particular quality to the quiet between us. We were all preparing, each in our own way. Osa was very still, which I had come to understand was how she processed incoming pressure. Quell was making rapid small notes on a data pad and then deleting them, which I had come to understand was how she organized her thoughts when she was uncertain. I was breathing slowly and deliberately, which was how the sorry regulate initial stress response. Dax was eating something, a small wrapped food item, consumed efficiently like someone making use of available time. He finished it, folded the wrapper neatly and put it in his bag. Sorex was standing slightly apart from the group. His bioluminescent patches were at a dim, even glow. He was not looking at the chamber door. He was looking at the ceiling of the corridor, which I thought was unusual until I realized he was looking at the ventilation layout, mapping the space automatically, assessing air circulation, exit configurations, structural elements, not because he had to, because his mind did it. The chamber door opened. A proctor inside the room confirmed our group, listed our names, and told us to proceed to the center of the space. We went in. The room currently looked like a plane. Interior smooth walls, even floor. Standard lighting, empty of features. The proctor told us to stand in the marked zone in the center, which we did. She confirmed that the scenario would begin without a countdown, and that we should treat everything in the simulation as real for the purposes of with the assessment. Then she left. The door closed. We stood in the center of the room. For a count of about 5 seconds, nothing happened. Then the lights shifted, not dramatically, just a slight change in color. Temperature from neutral to the faint yellow-orange of a world with a different star. And then the walls changed. The smooth interior became a textured exterior, projected but convincing. A settlement, low buildings, industrial, functional, not decorative, a sky that was slightly too bright. And then the sound layer came in. Alarms, not distant, present, layered. Different tones at different intervals, each one representing something specific in the system of whatever facility we had just been placed inside. And beneath the alarms, a structural sound, a low intermittent vibration that I felt in my feet before I heard it with my ears. Osa went to the nearest projected interface panel, which had appeared on the wall to our right. She scanned it fast. Geological event, she said. Active subsidence. The settlement is built over an unstable stratum, 3 zones showing critical stress fracture indicators. Zone 1 is the water reclamation system. Zone 2 is the main population shelter. Zone 3 is the power grid. Population count, Quell said sharply. Osa scrolled. 412 registered residents, plus 83 temporary workers. 495 total. The structural vibration in the floor deepened. Evacuation protocol, Sorex said. His voice was completely level. He was already moving toward the room's far wall, where a secondary panel had appeared showing facility layout. Where are they? The system has them, Osa said. But the Zone 1 failure is blocking the automated routing. The shelter system cannot calculate exit paths without reclamation data because the two systems are linked. Decouple them, Quell said. I am trying. The interface requires authorization from a facility engineer. There is no engineer online. The cascade started at shift rotation. There is a gap. The scenario had been running for less than 90 seconds, and we were already in a gap. I moved to help Osa with the panel. I found the authorization requirement and looked for a workaround. There was one, a manual override route, but it required simultaneous input from two separate panels at opposite ends of the facility layout. Quell, I said, I need you on the east terminal. I will take the west. Simultaneously on my mark, Quell was already moving. Then the second cascade happened. The power grid panel flashed. Red Zone 3 was gone, which meant the east terminal Quell was heading toward had just lost power. Quell stopped, looked at me. The vibration deepened again. One of the wall projections flickered, indicating real structural movement. The simulation, a sound of something giving way somewhere below us. The manual override requires powered terminals, Osa said very calmly. The way people speak when they are controlling something with effort, both of them. We have one. Sorex was at the facility map. Back up. Power cell location, he said. Is it on this map? Osa cross-referenced. Emergency cell bank storage room, sub. Level 2, but the sub-level stairwell is in Zone 1. The zone showing subsidence. It may not be safe. May not, Sorex said. The structural reading shows it at 62%. Integrity, the threshold for condemned passage, is 50. Sorex took one step toward the sub-level indicator, and then Dax spoke. Hold, he said. His voice was not loud. It was not commanding in the way of someone trying to impose authority. It was direct in the way that a specific word spoken at the right moment stops a sentence. Everyone looked at him. He was standing in the same position he had been since the scenario started, not at a panel, not reviewing the map. He had been listening, taking it all in. And now he was talking, and the pace of it was different from anything I had heard from him in a classroom. Not slower, not faster, just precise. The way a tool operates when you have matched the tool to the task. We do not send one person to the sub-level, he said. We cannot afford to use the 62% corridor until we know what we are getting. Osa, what is the projected time to failure for Zone 2? The shelter, Osa checked, 11 minutes at current stress rate, but the rate is accelerating, and time to structural failure for the sub-level stairwell at current subsidence pace. She checked, 18 minutes. Possibly less if Zone 1 loses. Integrity first. We have a window, Dax said. Small. Osa, what is the maximum resident count that can shelter in the above-ground secondary facility? The one shown north of the main cluster. Osa found it. 190. It is rated for short-term emergency use only. Good, that is where the most mobile residents go first. It buys us time on Zone 2 collapse, because we reduce the load on the primary shelter. Quell, can you run the evacuation routing manually through the working terminal if I give you the path calculations? Quell stared at him for half a second. Then she said, yes, if the calculations are right, they will be. Dax said, not arrogantly, just as information. I watched him. He had not moved to a panel. He did not touch the facility map. He was working from what he had heard and seen in the first 90 seconds of the scenario, carrying the numbers in his head, running the calculations in real time. Sorex, he said. The Krath looked at him. You and I go to the sub-level You, because if anything in that stairwell fails unexpectedly, you are the most likely of this group to handle it and stay functional. Me, because I know the power cell configuration from the layout OSA pulled, and I can restore the east terminal faster than you can. We go together. We are back in 7 minutes. Can you move fast in a confined space? Sorex looked at Dax for a long moment. The bioluminescent patches were still quiet. Then he said, yes. Then we go now, Dax said. Felon, I looked at him. You stay with Osa and Quell. If we are not back in 8 minutes, find another way to restore the east terminal and do not wait for us. He said it the way you say something when you have thought about it clearly and decided it is the right thing. I said understood. And then Dax and Sorex were moving toward the sub-level indicator, and Quell was at the west terminal, and Osa was feeding her the numbers, and I was cross-referencing evacuation capacity and resident distribution data as fast as I could read it, and the structural vibration in the floor was getting worse. What happened in the sub-level, I did not see. What I know is what the simulation logs showed in the debrief. Afterward, the stairwell lost another 4% integrity while they were in it. There was a partial collapse of a sidewall. Not the main path, but close enough that the debris field blocked their initial route to the cell bank. Dax found an alternate routing through a utility corridor that was not on the main map, accessed by a maintenance access point that was labeled but not highlighted. He had noticed it in the first layout scan. They reached the cell bank. Dax restored power to the east terminal in 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Quell and Osa completed the override. The evacuation routing came online. The shelter decoupling worked. The north facility received its first wave of residents. The main shelter load dropped to manageable levels when Dax and Sorex came back through the sub-level indicator with 2 minutes to spare. Simulation was not finished. The scenario had another phase, a secondary geological event, an unexpected one that hit the north facility and compromised it, which meant 200 residents were now outside of any shelter in an active geological event zone with a power restored but structurally damaged facility. And about 9 minutes before the scenario declared total loss, Dax did not stop moving. He went directly to the facility map. He asked Sorex the load-bearing capacity of the main road overpass. Sorex, who had been mapping structural elements since the scenario began, gave him the number. Immediately, Dax said the overpass could hold the full resident count if they reached it before the next stress fracture propagated through Zone 1. He told me to call the routing. He told Osa to monitor the fracture propagation rate. He told Quell to coordinate the timing the resident movement so the overpass received staggered load rather than simultaneous load, which would reduce the structural risk by a significant margin. The scenario ran for another 7 minutes. When it ended, the lights returned to neutral. The projected walls went blank. The alarm sounds cut out in the silence that replaced them felt very large. Proctor came back in. She looked at her assessment pad. She looked at us. Then she said, in a very level voice, "Please proceed to the debrief room." The debrief room was next door to the simulation chamber. It had a table, chairs, and a large display screen on the front wall. 3 instructors were present. including Professor Yorn. The display showed a summary page that we could not read from where we sat. Professor Yorn looked at us. You are one of two groups that completed today's scenario, she said. This exercise has an 11-year history in this academy. The completion rate across that history is approximately 12%. I heard Osa make a very small sound beside me. The scenario was taken from a real incident, Professor Yorn continued, a colony evacuation event from 32 years ago in the outer Midori territories. The original emergency lasted 4 hours. 461 residents survived out of 495. She paused. The incident record notes that the coordinator who managed the emergency response was a human contractor who had been assigned to the colony 6 weeks prior. She looked at the table. The contractor's name is in the record. He had no formal emergency management credentials. His prior experience was in geological survey work. The room was quiet. She looked at Dax, not with any particular expression, just a direct considering look. Your approach to this scenario tracked closely with the documented approach of the original coordinator, she said. Overpass decision in particular was nearly identical. Dax was looking at the summary on the display screen. He said after a moment, the overpass was the only structure with sufficient load rating and enough distance from the Zone 1 fracture line. It was the obvious call. Obvious, Professor Yorn repeated. Given the constraints, Dax said. Yes. Professor Yorn looked at him for another moment. Then she made a note on her pad and turned to address the full group. I did not hear most of what she said next. I was watching Sorex. He was sitting at the debrief table, both large hands resting flat on the surface, his bioluminescent patches running a slow to continuous cycle that I had not seen from him before. Not threat dark, not rest dim. Something in between that moved steadily, like breathing, like a system that has received a significant input and is processing it thoroughly. He was not looking at the display. He was not looking at Professor Yorn. He was looking at Dax, and Dax was still looking at the summary screen, reading the incident record with the same focused, quiet attention he brought to everything, apparently unbothered by being in a debrief room, apparently unbothered by having just navigated a simulated catastrophe, apparently unbothered by the fact that half the room was looking at him the way you look at something you thought you understood and have since discovered you understood incorrectly. When the debrief ended and we were cleared to leave, I gathered my things slowly. Quell and Osa left together talking. Quietly, Sarek stood and moved toward the door. He passed close to Dax as he had on the first day of class. He stopped. Arlo, he said. Dax looked up at him. Sarek was quiet for a moment, then he said, in Krath, one word. The same word he had told me in the library annex, the two-syllable word that rose and then fell, the one that meant something between acknowledgement and warning, the word his culture used for things that existed outside the expected logic of their category, things that had been tested by everything in their environment and had not been removed. Dax looked at him. I do not think he understood the word. He probably could not have, but something in the way Sarek said it, the weight it carried, the way Sarek held still after saying it, made Dax Pause, he looked at Sarex for a moment. Then he nodded once, a small, quiet nod. The kind that is not agreement exactly, but something more like acknowledgement. Like receiving something and choosing to carry it. Sarex turned and walked out. I stood in the doorway of the debrief room and watched both of them move down the corridor in opposite directions. Dax had his bag over his shoulder and his data pad in hand. He was already reading something. He turned the corner and was gone. Outside, the academy's afternoon light was coming through the high corridor windows, falling in clean, angled lines across the floor somewhere in the building. The other groups were still finishing their simulations or beginning their debriefs, or standing outside chambers wondering what was waiting for them inside. I thought about what Professor Yorn had said. 12% completion rate, 11 years. A scenario drawn from a real event. A human contractor with no credentials and a background in geological survey, who had looked at a dying, collapsing settlement and found the obvious answer in a place where every other responder had apparently missed it. I thought about the first day of class and a human walking into a room with a craft predator in it and sitting down and not moving and smiling. I thought about a craft sitting in a library annex telling me about organisms that exist outside the expected logic of their category, that have been tested by everything and remain. I thought about a malfunctioning evaluation machine and a student who asked if it was working correctly. I thought about a two-syllable word in a language I did not speak, said by the most dangerous student in the academy to the least visibly dangerous student in the academy, in a tone that was not threat, not praise, but something older than both. I had come to the academy to learn about the galaxy, the biology of different species, the history of interspecies contact, the mechanisms of communication across vast differences in culture and physiology and experience. I had learned those things. I was still learning them. But standing in that corridor with the afternoon light on the floor and the sound of the building continuing around me, I thought that the most complete education I had received in 2 years at the academy had come from watching what happened when a craft predator and a human Deathworlder were placed in the same room. Neither of them had tried to be remarkable. That was what I kept coming back to in the end. Sarex had not tried to be frightening. He was simply what he was, a product of a severe world shaped by a long history of surviving it. And Dax had not tried to be impressive. He was simply what he was, too, a product of a world so severe that the beings it had produced no longer registered severity as alarm. They registered it as the background against which everything else happened. Two different shapes of the same fundamental fact. Life, under pressure for long enough, becomes something very hard to remove. I walked back toward my dormitory. I had assignments to finish and notes to write and a long week still ahead of me. But I was thinking about Earth, about a world that had spent its entire history trying to eliminate the species it produced, and the species it produced had named everything that tried to remove them, cataloged it, studied it, and built their homes next to it. I was thinking about what it means to look at an apex predator and smile. I was thinking about what it costs a world to make a being that can do that. And I was thinking that the cost must have been enormous. And I was thinking that whatever paid that cost was still there, walking the corridors of the Academy with a data pad and a bag over one shoulder, eating a wrapped food item in a hallway. Before a practical, asking a proctor if a machine was working correctly, still. There, completely ordinary, completely unremarkable, completely outside the logic of its apparent category, and the world had tried for a very long time. The world had tried